All right, I am live. So I'm using StreamYard this time because Restream decided to be a little bit frustrating to me the last couple days. But I'm here, I'm live. Hopefully, some people are going to join me. What I'm going to do just real quick is check to see how it looks from like a YouTube perspective. So just give me 1 second to do that. Okay, awesome. So everything that I wanted to have shown on the YouTube channel appears to be there. So let's get started. And perhaps I should probably start with my own perspective on kind of the text that we're going to be reading today. Okay. So CJ Cornwith, great YouTube channel. I don't always agree with him, but he always provides this kind of interesting perspective that I often find useful. Today he was talking about this kind of hypothesis that Bauer has. Okay. And basically, kind of how it goes is that you have these kind of two competing visions of the early history of the church. Okay. The first one is that the history of the early church is basically you've got this one solid foundation and that just goes marching forward and, everybody just splits off and their hair sticks and everything. And today the right one has finally won out. Versus kind of Bauer's perspective that no, there wasn't like a singular Christianity. It was like there were these many different Christianities that were competing, and what we call now today Orthodoxy was just kind of one of these many competing like ideas. Okay. And like to me it feels like it's just an argument again. And again, this thing came out in 1930s. Okay, it got published into English 10 years before I was even born. So maybe this is just kind of my perspective from having been having grown up with this already impacted, and I'm kind of already inoculated against it, as it were. But to me, it just sounds like he's kind of stating the obvious. The Sunday school lies to children version isn't what happened. And that's true of just about every single historical thing. The Civil War didn't go down quite the same way that it does in our popular imaginations. And so I don't think we should really expect the early church to be any different, right? And I think the Civil War is a good example because you could be like, well, what happens is that there were two Americas and neither one really had a claim to be like the real America. And then what happens is that the North won out, and that's why we just have one America now, And that is, it's not a terrible hypothesis, but I feel like it's just a slightly different perspective, probably a more nuanced perspective on what happens with it. On what's happening here. All right. So let's get into this whole introduction, and I'm just going to read it. I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to give my thoughts about the arguments that are being made in this introduction. Right? So let's get started. Introduction. Orthodoxy and heresy, we all know what enormous importance is usually attached to these two concepts for the history of our religion. Usually, however, investigation of this subject tends to focus upon the latter epochs. The period of Christian origins is, as a rule, passed over rather briefly. Of course, the errors combated in the earliest literature of Christianity are described and investigated from various points of view with this or that result, but it's usually done with implicit or even explicit absent assent to the view that any such divergence, it really is a corruption of Christianity. Yes, I think this was absolutely true in the 1930s. Yeah. I think that nowadays, it's because of the impact of this book, it has changed since then, right? And I think that is it really a corruption of Christianity? I think that if Christianity is true, or at the very least you believe Christianity is true, I think that's certainly one appropriate way to view things, right? So, because all of these are errors that or ideas that were combated by basically what became the Orthodox Christianity, right? And there's kind of this idea that ultimately kind of the truth will prevail, right? And so if your view is that in Christianity, the truth of many of these issues eventually prevailed, then kind of the view that any such divergence is really a corruption of Christianity is just kind of naturally falls out of that. Okay. Here's the thing though. Okay. In your kind of modern academic sort of perspective, it doesn't matter what you believe. You just kind of bracket that off. And you're like, this is what happened, and we're not really going to decide who was right about these various contested issues. We're just going to kind of describe them and maybe argue for them, right? And see how them. We're not really looking for the truth of theology. We're just saying, hey, here's the theological debates without, for the lack of a better word, of favoritism for or against Christianity. And I think there are people who do it who are against Christianity, but fair treatment, and here's just a fact about human psychology, fair treatment feels like persecution after you've been treated, let's just say, more than fairly previously, right? I think also as a Christian, like it's completely fine to do this kind of bracketing and say, okay, hey, what were people really saying? What were their arguments? Are their arguments good? I think that's probably a good kind of way to view things and whatnot. So, like, yeah, I think he's basically right here. Okay, and especially 100 years ago. But if we follow such a procedure and simply agree with the judgment of the anti-heretical fathers for the post-New Testament period, do we not all too quickly become dependent upon the vote of but one party, that party which perhaps as much through favorable circumstances by its merits eventually was thrust into the foreground, and which possibly has at its disposal today the more powerful and thus the prevalent voice, only because the course of the others has been muted? Must not the historian, like the judge, preside over the parties and maintain as a primary principle the dictum auditur et allor pares, let the other side also be heard? When one group cannot, because of anxiety, confusion, clumsiness, gain proper recognition, is it not the obligation of the judge and mutual mutandis of the historian to assist it as best as he can to unfold the case, and simply submitting to the mental agility and firmness, the sagacity and locatiousness of the other? Does either judge or historian dare to act as though we can, whatever cannot be read and understood by everyone as part of the public records never existed, and thus is unimportant for the passing sentence? Yeah, no, he's right here. I think where I would probably differ with him is that as a historian, I don't think you necessarily need to reach a conclusion. Right? It is sufficient for the historian's task to lay out and elucidate what happened in history, what people said, what arguments were made, so on and so forth, right? Without making any decision about who was right, who was wrong, and why. However, for the Christian, right, these are not the person of Jesus. Is he really God? Is he not? What is his relationship with God? Just to kind of name one area of difference. This is not a mere historical curiosity, right? It is a question that informs our faith. And we have to make a decision about it. And even here, I'm going to be slightly agnostic to bracket off kind of my own specific opinions about who is right on whatever questions that we might come across in this when it comes to theology. Right. But, I might be like, hey, we need to go a little bit deeper into this and make a decision about who is really right, too. And that's also important for us to do. And I don't think that the historian should look at the believer and, for the lack of a better word, despise him for having made a decision about who is correct in these matters and who is not. Okay. In our day and age, there's no longer any debate that in terms of the scientific approach to history, the New Testament writings cannot be understood properly if one now looks back at them from the end of the process of canonization as sacred books and prizes them as constituent parts of the celestial chart of salvation with all attendant characteristics. Sure, if you're taking a scientific approach to history, I think that's right, However, the scientific approach to history is not the only approach to history, right? There is a, for lack of a better word, a theological approach to history, trying to figure out what we can learn from history. And the scientific approach will certainly inform that, right? But the scientific approach to history is not going to tell you by itself who is wrong and who is right about these things. Okay, we have long since become accustomed to understanding them in terms of their own time. The Gospels as more or less successful attempts to relate the life of Jesus, the Pauline letters as occasional writings connected with specific and unrepeatable situations, and having spatial as well as temporal limitations to the sphere of their authority. We must also approach the heretics in the same way. We need to understand them also in terms of their own time and not evaluate them by means of ecclesiastical doctrine, which was developing or which later became a ready-made norm. And yeah, I think this is correct in terms of the kind of scientific approach to history. I think that as somebody who is part of an ecclesiastical community, as one might say, that we have that there's, for lack of a better word, there's this conclusionlessness about the matters of faith that a scientific historian does, right? But, and I think that for lack of a better word, a faithful historian has, and what I mean by faithful is anybody can act as a scientific historian, and most people should in some way act as a scientific historian. But when I say a faithful historian, it's not to distinguish between a person as kind of roles, right? A scientific historian will tell you, here is our best guess at what happened, okay? And here's our reasons. A kind of a faithful historian will be like, okay, let's go through these arguments. Let's take a position and let's defend that position, right? And that, and like, I don't know, to me, many scientific historians kind of look down at this picking sides and having a position that you're going to defend, right? But it's not helpful, right? The truth is that we have to make decisions about what we believe, right? And in making those decisions, we need good information, which the scientific history can provide us. And I think that we shouldn't confuse the two, right? What is it that we can know from history versus what are our opinions about that history, shall we say, right? So perhaps this difference will help, okay? So I had this one professor in college. He was a great guy, had an amazing class discussion. He would always propose these various philosophical questions, and he was very good at not letting any of the students know what he really believed, right? And that's kind of the picture of the scientific historian, right? He constantly is throwing out these, and he's just committed to this historical truth that's devoid of opinion about the meaning and the impact of it, right? However, because I had been raised in the community, I happened to know that he did have opinion. He actually had opinions, honestly, rather strong ones, about the ideas that he put forward, these philosophical ideas that he put forward, right? And so what happens is that he is that and when I asked him about this, right, because I knew, so he had this one particular perspective, right, and I was like, so what's up with this? I know that you think this. Why can't I tell? Why aren't you more aggressive about talking about it in class and whatnot? And he's like, that's Faith, you got to really understand. That's what I believe, right? I think that the best arguments all lead there, okay? But there are plenty of smart and wise philosophers who believe different things. And my role as a teacher here, okay, is not to say this is right, this is wrong, right? But to show all of the alternatives here, okay, and let the students think through them, right? Because thinking through something is how you improve your mind. And I'm more interested in how you improve your mind than basically than declaring my own opinion on these things, right? And okay, I've forgotten where I was. Basically, I think that the historian has the luxury of bracketing many difficult questions, but those difficult questions are things that people who are not historians kind of have to answer, if that makes sense. So anyway, we can determine adequately the significance the heretics possess for nascent and developing Christianity only when we, insofar as it is possible, place ourselves back into the period in which they went about their business and, without hesitation, cast all of our preconceived ideas aside. Indeed, we must remain open to all possibilities, which constitutes truth in one generation can be out of date in the next, through progress, but also through retrogression into an earlier position. The actual situation in one religion may not obtain in another, indeed, may never have had general currency. Perhaps, and I repeat, perhaps certain manifestations of Christian life that the authorities of the church renounce as heresies originally had not been such at all. But at least here and there were the only form of this new religion. That is, for those religions, they were simply Christianity. The possibility also exists that their adherents constituted the majority and that they looked down on with hatred and scorn on the Orthodox, who for them were the false believers. I do not say this in order to introduce some special use of language for the investigations which follows, so that orthodoxy designates preference of a given majority, while heresy is characterized by the fact that only minority adhere to it. Majority and minority can change places, and then in such a use of language, which would be able to represent this change only with difficulty, would easily lead to obscurities and misunderstandings. No, even in this book, Orthodoxy and Heresy will refer to what one customarily and usually understands them to mean. There's only this proviso, that we will not hear the two of them discussed by the church, that is, by one party, but by history. Again, like, I feel like he's completely right here. That this is that what Bauer is setting out is that this is a history book. Okay, this is where he is trying to drill down and get at the data. Okay, that's what I'm reading here, and provide the data without favoring the Orthodox or the Orthodoxy and the heresy, right? It just, okay, and that is absolutely the right move for a historian, even a historian who happens to be Orthodox, to do, right? Because to me, I'm more interested in truth than I am in tradition personally, right? I think that things become tradition because they have some truth in them, but that isn't the same thing as um, uh, as them being true, you know? So yeah, like I would consider myself to be a deeply committed Christian, and so far I have nothing to complain about. Nothing. Okay, about William Bauer's book. In order to exclude from the outset all modern impressions and judgments, I will proceed from the view concerning the heretics and their doctrines, which was cherished already in the second centuries by the ancient church, and will test its feasibility in hopes of discovering by means of such critical procedure a route to the goal. The ecclesial position includes roughly the following main points, and we'll get into them just one second. But I'm going to probably read back a little bit and figure out what he means by the goal so that I can state the goal here. Goal. And I'll note this, perhaps, I repeat, perhaps. He's caveating this a little bit because he's living in a much more, for lack of a better word, Christian version of the world. And kind of the tension that he's identifying here is the tension between the historian and the person who makes a decision about the things the historian brackets. Okay, so what his goal here is to lay out to discuss the relationship of orthodoxy and heresy from a scientific historical point of view, which I'm good. Yeah, no, that seems to be his goal, and I'm here for this. The ecclesiastical position. So basically, what has to happen is that now that he said, okay, cool, we are going to look at what is orthodox and what is heresy, okay, from a historical perspective without prejudicing either of them, okay. We're going to then detail what we mean by the orthodox position, because heresy is much more easily defined as everything other than orthodox. Okay, so here is the kind of ecclesial position, and its main points. And there's 4. Let's see here. I think 4 main points. Okay, so Jesus reveals the pure doctrine to his apostles, partly before his death and partly in the 40 days before his ascension. Yeah, and so I think 1 actually has to be true for the quote unquote heretic as well. Okay. 2, after Jesus' final departures, the apostles apportion the world among themselves, and each takes the unadulterated gospel to the land which has been allotted to him. Again, I think this is something that has to be true for the heretic as well, right? Because if the disciples don't, either, or Jesus did not reveal pure doctrine, right? In which case, you're kind of like going, okay, here's this Jesus data, and we're going to take it as maybe right, maybe not, and everything's fallible. But most heresies, I think, have a fairly high view of Jesus, that he is revealing the pure doctrine, right? And that they have received this pure doctrine perhaps through means of secrets. And I think that, or through the teaching of some person who's in the know, right? Now, in 2, I think where this is kind of distinguished is that there's this kind of apostolic perspective that gets preserved through history, and that these apostles have the unadulterated gospel. So I don't really know. So by the apostles, though, okay, I think we have to constitute that as a more broader meaning of the word apostle, because, yeah. So we're not talking the apostles, but also the apostles and kind of their successors in the church, right? 3, even after the death of the apostle, the gospel branches out further, but now obstacles to it. So this is one place where I think he's probably wrong. I think that obstacles to it that spring up within Christianity happened based on the writings of Paul, more or less instantly, right? So even after the death of the apostles, the gospel branches out further, but now obstacles to it spring up within Christianity itself. I would disagree with him. I would say that these obstacles that he's talking about spring up well before the death of the apostles, right? The devil cannot resist sowing weeds in the divine wheat field, and he is successful at it. True Christians blinded by him abandon pure doctrine. Okay. This development takes place in the following sequence: unbelief, right belief, wrong belief. There is scarcely the faintest nation anywhere that unbelief might be changed directly into what the church calls false belief. No, that's wrong. No, where there's heresy, orthodoxy must have proceeded. For example, Origin puts it like this: all heretics at first are believers, then later they swerve from the rule of faith. I feel like he's arguing it's something I don't really know. The view is so deeply right. All heretics are first believers, then later they swerve from the rule of faith. This view is so deeply rooted and so widely held that it applies even to such personalities as Manny, who was supposed to have been a presbyter of the church in a valiant war against both Jews and pagans, but then left the church because he took it as a personal offense that his students received such scanty recognition. In general, it is an opinion of orthodoxy that only impure motives drive the heretic from the church. Indeed, this must be so if the evil one is at the bottom of it all. Already, Hesgippus, who was in Rome around the year 160, asserts that after the martyr's death of James the Just, Theodotus had begun to corrupt the church, which till then had been a pure virgin, although through false belief, because he had not succeeded James as the leader of the Jerusalem community. We hear similar things about Valentinus and Marcion and Bersinides. I think that maybe I'm just really skeptical of unbelief, right belief, wrong belief, and then just go from unbelief to wrong belief. Where there's heresy, orthodoxy must preceded it. I don't know. I'm a bit more skeptical. I think that this might be how the church fathers present it, as unbelief, right belief, wrong belief. But for example, in Acts, right? You've got Simon Magus. He goes from unbelief to wrong belief fairly directly, right? So if I'm going to question his hypothesis, I think I'm probably going to be questioning it a lot at 3. But I think the strongest version of 3 that I agree with is that is how the church fathers viewed the development, right? Even then, I questioned after the death of the disciples bit, because even in the authentic letters of Paul, we see him struggling against heresy. You see the problem there, So 3 is questionable, but Origen putting it this way, in that this is how I think that we should read this as this is how the fathers thought of this, was that at first all heretics are believers, and then they swear to the rule of faith. So that this is the view of the church fathers, that wherever there's false belief, their right belief must have followed by wrong belief. I feel skeptical, right, of this idea. But I don't know, he might be right about this is how the church saw it. Okay. Anyway, so this is how the Orthodox perspective takes things. Of course, right belief is invincible in spite of all the efforts of Satan and his instruments. It repels unbelief and false belief. It sends its victorious sway even further. Yeah, that is probably the Orthodox perspective, right? And here's another thing I'll note. I don't think history is probably the right tool to judge whether or not 4 is true. And here, Bauer is not discussing whether or not 4 is true. He's basically saying this is what they believed, right? 8. Okay. But somebody who is a Christian or not a Christian is going to have to make a decision about whether or not you believe what the right beliefs are. right? Because everybody has their own worldview. And I need to get back here, see if anybody's joined me. Yeah. So I agree with him. I think these 4 marks are probably good marks of orthodoxy, right? In my mind, I think in my definition of orthodoxy, I'd probably also include a bit more a bit more of the specific doctrine. So like the Trinity and all that kind of getting fun stuff. And that's typically how I would probably define orthodoxy rather than how he's doing it here. Right? Anyway, sorry. So TLDR, I think he's found a way to identify orthodoxy. I probably would have looked at it a bit differently, but I think that it's serviceable. And it works mostly. Scholarship has not found it difficult to criticize these convictions. It knows that the ecclesiastical doctrine was not yet present with James. Likewise, that the 12 disciples by no means played the role assigned to them out of consideration for the purity and the revealed nature of ecclesiastical dogma. Further, historical thinking that is worthy of this name refuses to employ the correlatives of true and untrue, bad and good, as they should. What they do is that they bracket these things, right? They say, I'm not going to be worried about what is true or untrue, what's bad and what's good. I'm going to bracket who is right here. And for historical thinking, this is absolutely correct. Okay? He's right. Okay? He's not evilly convinced of the moral inferiority he attributed to the heretics. Of course, right for historical thinking. We recognize that they're the same embarrassed and thus artificial claim that emanated from Jewish Christianity when it asserted that Paul had sued the hand of the high priest's daughter, and when it was denied to him, began to rage against the Torah. What in the world? That doesn't make sense on like a couple different levels for kind of the things. I'll have to find. I'm going to go off route real quick and find this quote because I don't think I've ever heard that story before, and it sounds like a fun story. Come on, give me some Epiphanius here. Ebionites, a Jewish Christian sect. Ah. 30:16:5. Okay. No, not the gospel. Church Fathers. Blatus superior applies to really and Clement. Hesgepius. Heresies. 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 I'm having some trouble finding it. Let's see here. Oh, okay. So it's also called the Panarion. Okay. So introduction. Okay, I think I found what I'm looking for. Okay, so 30:16. 30 is against the Ebionites on 131. And that's way too far. Okay, 160. Ebionites. Okay, 30. So 1.30.16. So this might take a little bit of looking here. 1.4. 5.10. 14. 16. So 30.16. Okay. So they too receive baptism apart from their daily baptisms. So this mystery from year to year, an imitation of the sacred mysteries of the church. Using unleavened bread, and the other part of the mystery with water only. Interesting. You know who also does water only? Yeah, it's the Mormons. Okay, I find that fascinating that the Ebionites would also do that. Okay. But as I said, they sat side by side, two who have been appointed by God, one being for Christ, one for the devil, and they say that Christ has been allotted the world to come, but this world has been entrusted to the devil, supposedly by the decree of the Almighty, at the request of each of them, which is a fascinating sentence to read if you've been reading your Heiser. Anyway, and they say this is why Jesus was gotten of the seed of man and chosen, and thus has been flamed by the Son of God, by election, and after by the Christ has come to them. But they say he is not begotten of God, Father, but created as one of the archangels, that he is the ruler of both the angels and all creatures of the Almighty. Again, this is interesting if you know your backstory about how there's this kind of debate between the two powers in heaven versus this kind of Metatron-ish highest creating being theology, right? Or, and came and instructed us to abolish the sacrifice. And their so-called gospel says, I came to abolish the sacrifices, and if ye cease not from sacrifice, wrath will not cease from you. Both these and certain things of the kind are guileful inventions which are current among them. They speak of other acts of apostles in which there is much thoroughly and pious material, and from them arm themselves against the truth in deadly earnest. They lay down certain sins and instructions that the supposed ascent of James, as though he was giving orders against the temple and the sacrifices and the fire on the altar, and that much else is full of nonsense. Nor are they ashamed to accuse Paul here with certain fabrications of their false apostles' villainy and imposture. They say that he was Taresian, which he admits himself and doesn't deny, and they suppose that he was of Greek parentage, taking the occasion from the same passage because of his frank statement, I'm a man of Tarsus, a citizen of no mean city. And they claim that he was Greek and the son of a Greek mother and a Greek father, but he had gone up to Jerusalem, stayed there a while, and desired the burial of the high priest, and had therefore become a proselyte and had been circumcised. But since he still could not marry that sort of girl, became angry and wrote against circumcisions, against the Sabbath, and against the legislation. But he is making a complete false accusation, this horrid serpent with his poverty of understanding. For Ebion, translated from Hebrew to Greek, means poor, and truly he is poor in understanding, hope, and actuality, since he regards Christ as a mere man, and is thus come to hope in him with the poverty of the flesh. They themselves, if you please, boastfully claim they are poor because they sold their possessions in the apostles' time and laid them at the apostles' feet and went over to a life of poverty amid renunciation. And thus they say they are called poor by everyone. But there is no clear truth to this claim, as he was really named Ebion. I suppose the poor wretch was named prophetically by his father and mother. Okay, that went a little bit into 17. But that is very interesting. I think as a historical hypothesis, that story runs into some trouble. Anyway, so that is the story of one second. Nope. Okay. So when I downloaded this, you got to look at this for a long time. I'm so sorry. Let me close these again so that you can have a better look here at the section I was reading because this is fun. I need to see because I was doing it over in the preview here, 187. So we are going to go 187. Okay. So let's zoom in. And so this is the section that I was reading from. So starting up here at 16:1 and continuing down through it. To, I think it was, no, that was the Valentinians. Sorry, I'm in the wrong section. Section 2, 180. Oh, sigh. It's 144 because they're numbering it differently. Yay. Yay for numbering things differently. So what we can see here is Ebionites, and then 16.1 all the way through this to 17.4 is where I ended it right here, prophetically by his father and his mother. Okay. That was fun. Let's get back to what we're supposed to be reading. See, okay, so this is fun. You find all of these little crazy things throughout history, and this is why reading history is fun. Reading Christian history is fun. Okay, so sooner or later, however, a point is reached at which criticism bogs down. For my taste, this all too easily submits to the ecclesiastical opinion as to what is early and late, original, independent, essential, and non-important for the earliest history of Christianity. If my impression is correct, even today, the overwhelming dominant view remains that for the period of Christian origin, ecclesiastical doctrine, and of course only as it pertains to a certain stage of its development, already represents what is primary, while heresies, on the other hand, somehow are a deviation from the genuine. I do not mean to say that this point of view must be false, right? So here again, Bauer is guarding against the imposition of people who want to unbracket stuff that history brackets, right? And wanting to force the historian to have an opinion that the historian kind of doesn't want to hold. The historian doesn't wants to just say, I don't really care who was right here. I just care what happened, right? What people said, what people meant, what people did, all that kind of fun stuff, right? And here he's guarding against it again, right? And in 1930 something, when this was released, that was absolutely necessary. Now I think it's probably a bit less necessary for academic history, but as somebody who is like, my name gives it away, faith from facts, right? I do have opinions here, right, as to who's going to be right, who's going to be wrong, and I'm not, because I'm not primarily acting as a historian, just somebody who wants to figure out what the right thing is. I'm going to have opinions, and I'm not going to bracket things that a historian might bracket when I'm looking at this. And I'll try to explain when I'm doing that, okay? False, but neither can I regard it as self-evident or even demonstrated and clearly established. Rather, we are confronted here with a problem that merits our attention. In this way, the subject of my book is defined more precisely, and I am left free to bypass, bracket, much else that could also be treated under the title I have selected. For example, I do not need to present, once again, a description of the tenets of the ancient histories, but presuppose that they are well known, along with many other things. So he's bracketing that stuff off, right? We live in a time that demands concise discussion, and repetition of what has already been presented in a suitable manner should not be tolerated. Therefore, he who opens this book in hopes of finding therein a convenient synopsis of what fellow scholars have already contributed to this or that aspect of the theme will be disappointed. As we turn to our task, the New Testament seems to be both too unproductive and too much disputed to be able to serve as a point of departure. The majority of its anti-heretical writings cannot be arranged with confidence either chronologically or geographically, nor can the more precise circumstances of their origin be determined with sufficient precision. Is it advisable, therefore, first of all, to interrogate other sources concerning the relationship of orthodoxy and heresy, so that with the insight that may be gained there, we may try to determine the time and place of their origins. I have chosen to begin with Edessa and Egypt so as to obtain a glimpse to the emergence and the original condition of Christianity in regions other than those that the New Testament depicts as affected by this religion. End of the introduction. And there are footnotes. I'm not going to read the footnotes, but wow. After reading that introduction, I kind of want to go read the whole book. I'm probably not going to, because this is the end of what I wanted to do, right? And so coming out of the end here, I don't really feel like my opinion on it's been changed, other than that William Bauer is trying to be a precise historian, right, and bracket a lot of the things that kind of the faith wants you to make a decision about. And for a historian, that's absolutely the right choice, right? I think that him perhaps not starting with the New Testament, I can understand why he's doing it the way he's doing it here. I think that the New Testament probably informs Orthodoxy. And I think there's probably certain places where you can be like, no, this also informs the heresy as well. And so, like, but I'll be honest, all of my criticisms of this are quibbles. He's right. When a man's right, he's right. And like, maybe if I read deeper into the book, I'll get to something that really challenges me. But his introduction, it's great. It's right. It's nothing I'm worried about. Nothing I find objectionable, right? I've got quibbles about how he says he's going to do stuff, not giant gaping, oh my gosh, this is a wound sort of feeling about it. Anyway, I'm going to end this stream. I've been going at it for an hour, and there's nobody watching this live for me to interact with. So I will see you later. I hope you enjoyed reading this. I kind of also want to read Epiphanius a little bit. So preview of what's coming up next. Who knows? I'll talk to you all later. Have a great night. Lord, I want to thank you for giving us the scholars, this person who has an interesting perspective, and for him to bless us with his perspective, with his challenge. Help it to enrich our faith, Lord. Amen.